Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we'll dive into a tense and emotional chapter of this story, the moment Mr. Hoan realizes James and Tu Diep have broken up and believes everything is finally back under his control. But behind that calm approval lies a choice that will change all their lives. If you find this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episodes. After James and Tu Diep officially broke up, Mr. Hoan was the first person to know. No one sat him down. No one explained anything. He didn't need words. He saw it in the way James came home every night on time, in the way his clothes were always neatly pressed, his posture straight, his answers short and respectful. He saw it in the silence James carried with him, heavy, controlled, and painfully disciplined. James had become exactly the kind of son a man like Mr. Hoan admired. He woke up early. He worked long hours. He followed schedules without question and instructions without complaint. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He didn't ask for exceptions. To anyone else, James looked mature, responsible, finally grown. To Mr. Hoan, it meant only one thing. Everything was back under control. One evening, the family sat in the vast dining room, surrounded by polished wood and expensive quiet. The servants moved softly in the background, placing dishes down with practiced precision. The sound of chopsticks tapping porcelain echoed faintly in the space. Halfway through the meal, Mr. Hoan placed his chopsticks down. He didn't look at James. His voice was calm, steady, almost casual. "You and that girl, it's over, isn't it?" James paused for a fraction of a second, just enough to inhale. Then he lifted his head. No excuses, no explanations, no hesitation. "Yes?" Mr. Hoan nodded slowly, as if confirming a number he already knew. "Good," he said. "That means you understand." He stood up, adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, his movements deliberate and composed. His tone was the same one he used when closing a deal or ending a negotiation. "Some people," he continued, "are only meant to appear in one chapter of your life. Not everyone who walks in deserves to stay." Under the table, James's fingers curled tightly into his palm, his nails pressed into his skin, grounding him. He looked up. "Aren't you going to ask?" James said quietly. "If I'm hurting?" Mr. Hoan finally met his son's eyes. There was no anger there, no cruelty, only certainty. "Pain is something you get used to," he replied. "Adults don't live by emotions." The words landed cleanly, without hesitation. And just like that, the last fragile hope James had been holding on to snapped. In the days that followed, Mr. Hoan began reorganizing his son's life as if Tu Diep had never existed. New schedules appeared on James's desk. New meetings filled his calendar. New faces, polite, well-dressed, carefully selected, were introduced over dinners and business lunches. "These are suitable connections," Mr. Hoan said. "People who can support your future." He called it preparation. He called it vision. James called it a life that no longer belonged to him. Once, late at night when the house was quiet and even the clock seemed to tick more softly, James finally asked a question he had been holding back. "If you lost Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "could you forget her?" Mr. Hoan didn't hesitate. "I don't have time to be weak," he answered. James nodded. He didn't ask again. On the other side of the city, Tu Diep also heard the news. Someone mentioned, almost casually, that James had moved back into his family home full-time, that he was busy, that he was doing well. Tu Diep wasn't surprised. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile people wear when they already knew the ending, but still hoped they were wrong. During the day, she worked. She focused on surviving. She handled responsibilities, made decisions, and kept herself moving because stopping meant thinking. At night, after Ly had finally fallen asleep, Tu Diep allowed herself to break. She sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking silently, afraid that even her tears might wake the child. She didn't curse Mr. Hoan. She didn't blame James. She only felt an overwhelming sadness for him. A man forced to choose reason over happiness. A man taught that love was a weakness to be corrected. By chance, sometime later, Mr. Hoan heard about Tu Diep again. An acquaintance mentioned it during a conversation that wasn't meant to be serious. She's struggling, the person said, working nonstop, raising a child alone. I heard she's been sick a lot from exhaustion. They paused, then added lightly, "That girl is too fragile. Life with James would only make things harder for him." Mr. Hoan didn't react. He simply replied, "Then she's even less suitable." No pause, no doubt. That night, Mr. Hoan stood alone by the window of his study. The city stretched endlessly below, bright lights, endless motion, ambition layered on ambition. It was a world he understood, a world built on order, discipline, and sacrifice. He knew James was hurting, but to Mr. Hoan, pain was acceptable. Being wrong was not. The next morning, he called James into his study. "I'll arrange for you to go abroad for a while," he said, folding his hands neatly on the desk. "You'll have an environment worthy of you there, new opportunities, a clean slate." James stood still. "And if I refuse?" he asked. Mr. Hoan answered immediately, "You'll regret it." James smiled, not bitterly, not angrily, just tired. "I already do." For the first time, Mr. Hoan froze, only for a second. Then his expression returned to calm. "You'll get used to it." James lowered his head. "Yes." That single word was enough for Mr. Hoan. But it was also the moment something closed forever. Because Mr. Hoan never realized that some children don't rebel, not because they agree, but because they've already lost everything that mattered. And in his unshakable certainty, Mr. Hoan believed he had saved his son. What he didn't know was that he had just pushed James one step farther away from the greatest happiness of his life. Time didn't stop after that conversation. It never does. James left the study the same way he had entered, quiet, composed, his back straight, his face unreadable. Anyone watching would have thought he had accepted everything without resistance, that he had chosen obedience once again. And maybe on the surface, he had. Days slipped into weeks. James continued preparing for the trip abroad as if nothing inside him was breaking. Documents were signed, meetings were attended, conversations stayed polite and efficient. He packed his suitcase carefully, folding each shirt with the same discipline his father had taught him. Mr. Hoan observed all of it with calm satisfaction. To him, this was proof that his son had finally returned to the right path, proof that emotions had been put back where they belonged, behind logic, behind duty, behind the weight of the family name. What Mr. Hoan didn't see were the nights, the long, silent nights when James sat on the edge of his bed, suitcase open, phone resting in his palm. He never turned it on. He didn't need to. Every memory surfaced on its own, the sound of Tu Diep's voice calling his name, the way she smiled when she tried to hide her worries, the quiet warmth of a life that once felt honest. James didn't cry. He had learned long ago that tears change nothing. Instead, something colder took root. Emptiness. Across town, Tu Diep felt it too. She sensed the distance before anyone said a word. It arrived slowly, like the air growing heavier before rain. People stopped mentioning James around her. Conversations ended the moment she entered the room. as if his name had become something fragile, something dangerous. One evening, Lynn finally said it out loud, her voice careful, almost apologetic. "James is going abroad," she said. "Probably for a long time." Tu Diep nodded, as if the words were expected. "I know," she replied quietly. She had known the moment he stopped calling. That night, after Ly fell asleep hugging her small pillow, Tu Diep sat by the window and let the silence settle around her. Outside, the city moved on, cars passing, lights blinking, laughter drifting up from the street below. Inside her chest, everything was still. She asked herself the question she had avoided for weeks. If love costs this much, is it still love? The day before James was supposed to leave, something unexpected happened. Mr. Hoan received a phone call, not from a business partner, not from an assistant. It was from an old friend, someone who had known him long before success sharpened his voice and hardened his eyes. "You're sending James away," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Mr. Hoan replied calmly. "It's necessary." There was a pause. "Do you remember," the man asked slowly, "what you were like at his age?" Mr. Hoan said nothing. "You once told me," the man continued, "that if you ever had a son, you'd never force him to live your unfinished life." Mr. Hoan tightened his grip on the phone. "That was before I understood how the world works," he said. "No," the man replied softly. "That was before you became afraid." The line went dead. That night, Mr. Hoan didn't sleep well. Memories he had buried for decades began to surface. His own youth, the choices he had made, the woman he loved and lost, not because of fate, but because he chose ambition over courage. By morning, he pushed those thoughts away. Regret, after all, was a luxury he had never allowed himself. Meanwhile, James stood alone in his room, staring at his packed suitcase, and something inside him finally gave way, not loudly, not dramatically, completely. He understood with painful clarity that if he left now, this would be the rest of his life. Obedience, distance, a quiet, permanent absence of joy. For the first time since the breakup, James made a choice that wasn't calculated, approved, or planned. He didn't go to the airport. Instead, he drove. At first, he didn't even know where he was going. His hands moved on their own, steering him through familiar streets, past places filled with memories he had tried so hard to erase. When he finally stopped the car, his heart was pounding. He was standing in front of Tu Diep's place. The door opened slowly. Tu Diep froze when she saw him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. James looked thinner, more tired, but his eyes were awake in a way they hadn't been for weeks. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for coming like this." Tu Diep swallowed. "You're supposed to be leaving today." "I know." The silence between them felt heavy but familiar. "I tried," James continued. "I tried to live the life they wanted for me. I tried to be reasonable. I tried to convince myself that letting go was the right thing to do." He exhaled slowly. "I failed." Tu Diep's eyes filled with tears. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "If your father finds out—" "Let him," James said. Two simple words, but they carried more weight than anything he had ever said before. "For the first time in my life," he continued, "I don't want to just exist. I want to live, even if it's messy, even if it's uncertain." Tu Diep shook her head, tears spilling freely. "If staying means you have to fight your family," she said, "I can't accept that." James stepped closer. "I'm not fighting them," he said softly. "I'm just not running anymore. I'm staying. I'm choosing to be here." Behind them, Nye stirred, her small voice drifting through the room. "Uncle James?" James looked toward the sound, his expression softening. He didn't kneel. He didn't make promises about forever. He simply said the truth. "I'm not leaving," he said to Tu Diep. "Not today, not like this." Tu Diep broke down, covering her face as the weight of the past weeks finally caught up with her. They didn't embrace. They didn't say everything was going to be okay. They just stood there, two people choosing honesty over escape. Miles away, Mr. Hoan sat alone in his study. His phone lit up with a single message. "I'm not going abroad. I'm staying." For the first time, the man who believed control was strength felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Fear, because he finally understood. Plans could be rewritten, careers could be redirected, but once a child chooses his own life, there is no forcing him back. And somewhere deep inside, a truth Mr. Hoan had denied for years quietly surfaced. Some losses don't look like failure. They look like control slipping away. After James and Tu Diep officially break up, Mr. Hoan is the first to sense it. Not through words, but through the sudden obedience of his son. James becomes disciplined, quiet, and compliant, exactly the kind of son Mr. Hoan approves of. Believing order has been restored, Mr. Hoan coldly confirms the breakup and reinforces his belief that emotions are weaknesses adults must overcome. As he restructures James's life with new plans and expectations, he dismisses Tu Diep's struggles as further proof she was never suitable. While James silently endures a life he no longer recognizes as his own, Tu Diep bears the pain alone, choosing love over destruction. This chapter reveals the true cost of control, showing how Mr. Hoan's stubborn certainty creates distance, not strength, and pushes his son further away from the happiness he once had.